Well, hi everyone. I have a major update for you on the partial collapse that occurred of the former Pfizer headquarters in New York City that occurred on July 7th, 2026. I'm recording this video on July 17th, and there's finally been an update from the structural engineer of record about this whole episode. So I'm going to go through this. I'm going to go through the latest updates, what's going on, and more importantly, this new development has major and unfortunately dire uh, implications for how this building project could go forward, as well as potentially with other building projects throughout the city of New York. So, G.A.C.E is the structural engineer of record. They designed the building expansion where the building was being extended both vertically and horizontally, anywhere from 10 to 19 stories. And we've got this article in the Gothamist that just came out earlier this morning. And this principal engineer with G.A.C.E, Chris Behan, blamed the incident on a failure to install the crucial reinforcement on 3 floors, including the 21st, where it collapsed. He's quoted as saying, "The reinforcement from the 19th floor to the top of the 21st floor, which would have significantly increased the column's strength, was never installed," Behan said in a written statement. "The structure was not reinforced as G.A.C.E.'s design required." And after this was released, the developer, Metroloft, has not issued any further statements. Although on the day of this partial collapse, the developer, the lead for Metroloft, Nathan Berman, was quoted in the CBS News article, stated in response to the question as to what he thought caused the issue, "It's not a design issue. The issue is strictly structural, having nothing to do with the conversion aspect of it. It's very strictly structural. We put more load on the columns than they could support," he said. Berman pointed to possible human error. "A certain section of a new addition in the building, in this massive building, having added a certain amount of loading to the existing building and having reinforced most of the other columns, we may have missed the 2 columns that buckled," he said. "We may have not reinforced them properly, or we may have missed them." So this goes back to what I was saying early on, that I suspect that it was a construction sequencing issue. Although a design error was always a possibility, I thought that to be a lower probability event. In fact, there are a number of engineers on YouTube blaming the structural engineer for a major design error, suggesting that, or even stating that they had to neglect the weight of the additional 10 to 19 floors. That in this case, the old building stopped at the 21st floor and they were extending it up to the 37th floor. And these engineers on YouTube were saying, "Oh, yeah, the structural designer didn't account for the additional loading," which I thought was nonsense. It just seemed like a basic issue that nobody would overlook. Now, it's not to say that the structural engineer has no responsibility, no culpability here. It really depends on what their scope of services were. And I'm going to touch on that here in a bit as well. But also, this points to a systemic error, a major problem involving multiple parties. You can't just say, "Oh, yeah, we were supposed to put this steel reinforcing on these steel columns to support the weight of all these additional stories, and it looks like somebody forgot." That's not acceptable. This could have been a major catastrophe even during construction, but even more so had this building been occupied. And this building was going to have a total of 1,605 residential units. So huge potential for extremely major disaster that was fortunately averted here. But what we're talking about, you can see the buckle column. It's one of 2 that was observed on the 21st floor. I'm not sure exactly what the wide flange section was for these existing columns. But for example, it could be a W section, 60 inches wide, and the 67 means it weighs 67 pounds per lineal foot. From this Gothamist article, the structural engineer was indicating that these were the design details that were submitted with the building plans for this retrofit from commercial office space to residential units. And in all these details, you could see that additional steel plates were to be welded to the outside of the flanges for this wide flange member. And apparently it wasn't done. I mean, you could see it in the photos of these buccal columns that it just looks like a wide flange section, or as an I-beam, as people commonly call it. So here's the building between 42nd and 43rd Streets, between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. As I mentioned, failing to reinforce critical structural elements in the building is not merely an oversight. It brings into question what potentially else was missed during the construction of this building. And not only that, city officials are reviewing other buildings that were constructed by this developer. And I can only imagine, I hope it doesn't come to this, but can you imagine somebody living in a converted office space to a residential unit and somebody knocking on their door saying, hey, we need to take the wallboard off your column here to make sure it was properly reinforced when they built the building? I don't know how far this review is going to go, but it has a extremely concerning potential to cause a lot of disruption. Obviously, there's already a major disruption involving this former Pfizer headquarters. This project is stalled out while city officials investigate. The developer's been required to bring in an independent structural engineer, Thornton Tomasetti, to find out what happened here. Thornton Tomasetti is a well-regarded structural engineering firm. But I want to go over important lines of responsibility for those of you who may not be familiar with commercial construction. So all the work is being done under the authority of the New York Department of Buildings. They issue the construction permits, they do the plan review. The plans are produced by the engineer of record, in this case, G.A.C.E. is the structural engineer for the project. So the developer owns the project. They retain the architect engineer, the special inspection agency, and I'm going to come back to that, and a construction manager. So again, we have Metroloft, who's the developer. We have CCM, Collaborative Construction Management, LLC. They're the construction manager. They're responsible for getting the work done. They do the scheduling, they do the sequencing, they hire the contractors. They do the work for converting this former office building into residential units. Then you have the structural engineer, G.A.C.E. Now, I mentioned that they may not be totally off the hook here. They reportedly have produced plans that indicated that these structural steel columns were to be fully reinforced and turned into a box section. I'd be curious whether the plan notes have any mention of the sequencing. Logically, you would do such reinforcement prior to adding several additional stories in excess of 14, 15, 16 stories. I keep hearing different numbers, but if the old building stopped at 21 stories and the new building's going to 37, that would be 16 additional stories on top of this section that had the partial collapse of the structural steel columns. But even if there was no plan note, if I was a designer of record, I would want to have some representation from my own firm during construction to make sure that construction was consistent with what my design intent was and what I had specified on the plans. For example, I used to do a broader array of geotechnical engineering services. These days, I'm focused on deep foundation design and testing for bridge foundations mostly. But back when I was doing things like global stability analysis for a retaining wall, you would have a wall supplier that would do the internal design for the wall, but they weren't geotechnical engineers. And the builder would have to go out and retain the services of a geotechnical engineer to do what's called global stability analysis to make sure the whole wall configuration was stable. And when I would do those global stability checks as part of my scope of services, I'd always insist on having enough fee to cover periodic site visits to make sure the contractor was building the wall in the manner that was specified and not create undue liability for me in case they did something that was improper and have the wall fail. And next thing you know, I could end up with a professional liability insurance claim, which is a real nightmare if you're a professional engineer. You're trying to avoid those things at all costs because they're extremely time consuming and it affects your premiums and your ability, quite frankly, to do work in the future efficiently and profitably. So I don't know what was in G.A.C.E.'s scope of services in terms of going out there periodically to observe the construction, but they're not primarily responsible for doing that anyway. That would be the purview of the Special Inspection Agency, who's reported to be Domani Special Inspections. But all the special inspection work is done under the authority of New York Department of Buildings. They approve which inspectors are allowed to perform these special inspection services. The reports go to the city. The city reviews this information in conjunction with the information that they generated during their plan review when they issued the initial construction permit. So they're the ultimate authority on these inspection services. And for something to apparently have been missed, like not reinforcing important structural steel columns in a building that was having several more stories added to it, is a serious lapse that could have been catastrophic. And in fact, there's still ongoing major disruptions to this area of New York City. 43rd Street still closed between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. There's a Hampton Inn directly across the street from this former Pfizer headquarters that can't operate right now. So there's been major disruption to businesses and residents in this area. And that's only going to continue because the developers indicated that they're going to have to come in and remove these affected stories, in excess of 15 stories, and rebuild them. So I'm just going to run through a few photos. This is the former Pfizer headquarters. You can see this flat roof area, which is the 21st floor. This is the area that developed the problem because below this former roof line, the 21st floor had the structural steel columns that buckled, and now they've got all this overlying construction to take the building up to the 37th floor. You see from this side here, we can see the stories from the upper step and the new addition that extends outward from the original face of the building all the way up to the now 37th floor. Zoom in on this area and you can see the buckled columns through the window. Quite distressing. And now you see all these tilted floors overlying the collapsed structural columns, that all these stories are going to have to be removed and rebuilt, presumably. So it begs the question, for now, they've just provided temporary shoring from the 21st down to the 9th floor so that no additional building distress would occur. But it makes you wonder about all the work that's been done to date in this building. Again, if something so serious and important like reinforcing structural steel columns was missed, what else could have been missed, if anything, with this building? It creates a lot of doubt. And I think they're looking at extensive delays here while they go through the full sequence of construction, not only for this building, but apparently they're investigating other buildings as well, they being the New York Department of Buildings. So I've done a couple of videos about this situation. Somebody just posted a comment asking if I was given one of these units in the completed building to live in for free, would I do it? And the short answer is it depends on what this investigation uncovers. This building's either going to be taken down in its entirety because the questions can't be fully resolved, or everything's going to be resolved and it's probably going to be one of the safest buildings to live in New York City. So it's a little early to tell. I would probably hedge towards the latter scenario where this is all going to get worked out. But whether this current developer is going to be the one to finish this building remains to be seen. These types of delays have serious consequences relative to loan costs for a building like this. If you're talking about a multi-month delay, that could be something that could force a developer into bankruptcy, but we'll see. So I'll continue to follow this story. So far, New York Department of Buildings has not released any detailed information. The city of New York has launched a criminal probe, and I think that's done to preserve evidence and just procedurally to have everything in place to cover all the aspects that would be needed for a thorough investigation. I don't think there's been any suggestion of any fraud or criminal activity at this point. It's just under the umbrella of that type of investigation for right now. So it's really quite an unbelievable story, in my opinion. So I'll continue to follow the developments. With that, I want to do another book mention, The Sympathizer by Tan Nguyen. This is a fantastic book about the immigrant experience, about the experiences in Vietnam during the war, And the author of this book really doesn't spare any of the major players in terms of his criticism. He criticizes the French, the Americans, the Vietnam communists, the South, the just a whole range of people. The United States, how they pursued this war and how they treated refugees coming back and how they were just handling everything. So I think this is a very well written book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I have a lot of people that I know that are immigrants from Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. And so I've been to Vietnam, I've lived in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand. And so I could really get more insight into things that I had encountered in my own life by reading this book. And I think it helps if you've read Graham Greene's The Quiet American or Maxine Hong Kingston's Tripmaster Monkey as just general background, but obviously this book stands quite well on its own. But if you've read those books, that provides some nice background. So if you're so inclined, I've got a link to this book in the description. With that, I want to send a shout out to those of you who've contributed to Buy Me a Coffee. That's one of the better ways to support this channel. I also want to thank the channel members and those of you who've contributed to Super Things. Additional great ways to support the channel. So stay tuned, everyone.